They were told that American soldiers would burn them alive, that their families would be shamed forever, that death was better than capture. But when 47 Japanese women in tattered military uniforms stepped off the transport ship in San Francisco Bay in August 1945, what they faced was not American cruelty. It was American rage. Hundreds of civilians lined the docks screaming, throwing stones, faces twisted with hatred. The women ran crying, covering their heads with their arms. And then something impossible happened. The American guards stepped between them and the mob. The enemy became their shield. They expected death. They received protection. This is not the story you learned in history class. This is not the sanitized version of what happened to prisoners of war. This is the story of what happens when everything you have been taught about your enemy turns out to be a lie. When the monsters become protectors. When hatred is met not with hatred but with hot showers and bacon and chocolate bars. When the most devastating weapon turns out not to be bombs or bullets, but simple human kindness. For 3 months in the fall of 1945, 47 Japanese women would live in an American prison camp in California. They would eat better food than they had seen in years. They would sleep in clean beds with warm blankets. They would receive medical care from gentle nurses and protection from angry mobs. And slowly, one act of mercy at a time, everything they believed about America would crumble. This is the story of Keiko Nakamura, 22 years old, a radio operator from Osaka who came to America expecting torture and found something far more confusing than cruelty. She found compassion. This is the story of Corporal Mike Sullivan from Iowa, whose brother died fighting Japan, but who chose to stand between a mob and prisoners rather than let hatred win. And this is the story of an impossible transformation of how bacon and hot water and one Hershey bar could undo years of propaganda. Because hatred is easy to carry. It fits comfortably in your heart. It gives you someone to blame something to fight against a reason for your pain. But kindness from your enemy, that is a burden that changes you forever. That is a weight that breaks down every wall you have built to protect yourself from doubt. What happened in Camp Norton, California in those 3 months would challenge everything these women believed about Americans, about war, about who deserved mercy and who deserved revenge. It would force them to choose between the comfortable certainty of hatred and the terrifying possibility that maybe, just maybe, they had been lied to about everything. But to understand how 47 enemy women ended up being protected by American soldiers from their own countrymen, we need to go back. Back to a small apartment in Osaka. Back to a family that was about to be torn apart by war. Back to a girl named Keiko, who wanted nothing more than to make her mother proud. Her name was Keiko Nakamura. Everyone called her Kei. She was born in Osaka in 1923, the first child of Hiroshi and Yuko Nakamura. Her father worked as a clerk in a shipping company. Her mother took in sewing to help make ends meet. They lived in a small apartment on the 3rd floor of a building that overlooked a narrow street where children played and merchants sold vegetables from wooden carts. When Kei was 8 years old, her brother Takeshi was born. She remembered holding him for the first time, this tiny red-faced creature who grabbed her finger with surprising strength. She promised herself that day that she would always protect him, that she would be the big sister he could count on, that she would teach him everything she knew about the world. They grew up together in that small apartment. Kei showed Takeshi how to fold origami cranes, how to catch beetles in the park, how to avoid the mean dog that lived 2 buildings down. They shared meals of rice and pickled vegetables around a low table. They slept on futons that they rolled up each morning and stored in the closet. They listened to their father's radio in the evenings, hearing news about places they had never seen, about a world that seemed very far away from their narrow street in Osaka. When Kei was 12, her father came home from work coughing. At first, it was just a small cough, the kind that happens when the weather changes. But it did not go away. It got worse, deeper, wetter. He started losing weight. His face became gaunt, his eyes hollow. Tuberculosis, the doctor said. There were treatments, but they cost money the family did not have. Kei's mother worked longer hours, taking in more sewing, staying up late into the night by candlelight to finish orders. Kei helped when she could, but she was just a child. Takeshi was too young to understand why their father was always tired, why he could not play with them anymore, why their mother cried quietly when she thought they were asleep. Her father died 6 months later. Kei was 13. Takeshi was 5. Their mother became the sole provider for the family, working from dawn until midnight, her fingers bleeding from needle pricks, her eyes straining in dim light. That was when Kei learned what responsibility meant, what sacrifice looked like, what it meant to be strong when everything inside you wants to break. She finished school and got a job in a textile factory. She gave every yen she earned to her mother. She helped Takeshi with his homework. She made sure he ate before she did. She wore the same dress for 3 years, patching it when it tore, letting out the seams as she grew. She never complained. Complaining was for people who had the luxury of choice. When Japan went to war with China in 1937, Kay was 14. The war seemed distant at first, something that happened in faraway places to other people. But slowly it crept closer. Food became scarce. Men disappeared into the military. The radio stopped playing music and started playing patriotic speeches. By 1941, when Japan attacked Pearl Harbor and went to war with America, everything had changed. The textile factory where Kay worked switched to making military uniforms. Her shifts got longer. The food rations got smaller. The air raid drills became more frequent. Takeshi was 13 by then, full of fire and patriotic fervor. He talked constantly about joining the military when he was old enough, about serving the emperor, about dying with honor if necessary. Kay listened and said nothing. She did not want him to go. She did not want to lose him the way they had lost their father. But she also knew that in Japan in 1941 there was no choice. The war would take him whether she wanted it to or not. In 1943, the government created the Joshigun, the Women's Military Auxiliary. They needed women to work as radio operators, nurses, secretaries, support staff for the military. They promised training, steady pay food rations, and the honor of serving the emperor. Kay was 20 years old. She volunteered. Her mother had looked at her with tired eyes and nodded. They both knew the family needed the money. They both knew that volunteering was better than being conscripted. They both knew that at least as a radio operator, Kay would not be on the front lines. She would be safe, relatively safe. The training was 6 weeks at a military base outside Tokyo. They taught her Morse code radio operation military protocol. They also taught her what to expect if she was ever captured by the enemy. Americans were barbarians, the instructor said. They did not follow the rules of war. They tortured prisoners. They showed no mercy, especially to women. Female prisoners were dishonored in unspeakable ways. Death was preferable. Suicide was honorable. Surrender was the ultimate shame. Kay believed them. Why would they lie? She was assigned to Saipan, a small island in the Pacific that served as a crucial communication hub for Japanese forces. She worked 12-hour shifts in a stuffy room filled with radio equipment, transmitting and receiving coded messages. She lived in a barracks with other women. They ate rice and dried fish. They bathed once a week when water was available. They watched the war get closer. In June 1944, American forces invaded Saipan. Kay spent 3 days and nights at her radio station transmitting urgent messages as the battle raged outside. The building shook with explosions. Dust fell from the ceiling. The other women prayed or stared at nothing with blank faces. On the third day, a bomb hit the building next door. The explosion threw Kay across the room. She hit the wall and felt something sharp slice across her arm. When she looked down, blood was running down to her elbow. A piece of shrapnel had cut a long gash from her shoulder to her wrist. One of the other women tied a strip of cloth around it to stop the bleeding. Kay went back to her radio. She transmitted messages with one hand while the other throbbed with pain. There was no time for anything else. When Saipan fell to American forces, Kay and the other surviving women were evacuated to other islands. She spent the next year moving from base to base, always one step ahead of the advancing Americans, always transmitting messages, always listening to the static and the code and the desperate voices asking for reinforcements that never came. In March 1945, the telegram reached her. Takeshi had been killed at Iwo Jima. He was 19 years old. He had been a Marine for less than a year. The telegram said he died heroically in defense of the emperor. It did not say how he died. It did not say if it was quick or slow, if he suffered or if he was afraid. It just said he was dead. Kay read the telegram 3 times before the words made sense. Then she folded it carefully and put it in her pocket. She returned to her radio station and worked a double shift. She did not cry. She could not afford to cry. Crying was for later, for when the war was over, for when she was home and could mourn properly. But the war was not over, and home was very far away. Her mother sent one letter after receiving news of Takeshi's death. It reached Kay 2 months later, forwarded through multiple military channels. The handwriting was shaky. The words were brief. Your brother died with honor. Do not shame us. That was all. 4 sentences. Kay read them over and over, trying to find comfort or guidance or something, anything that felt like connection. But all she found was duty. Do not shame us, which meant do not surrender, do not be captured, do not come home dishonored. Die if you must, but die honorably. Kay kept that letter with her always. It was in her pocket on August 15, 1945, when the emperor's voice came through the radio speakers announcing Japan's surrender. The voice of a god telling them the war was over, telling them they had lost, telling them to lay down their arms and accept defeat. Some women in her barracks wept. Others sat in shocked silence. A few began preparing to take their own lives. Suicide was honorable. Surrender was shame. Better to die as a proud Japanese woman than live as a dishonored prisoner. But before anyone could act, American soldiers arrived. They gathered up the female auxiliaries, loading them onto trucks, then onto ships. They were told they were being taken to America as prisoners of war. They would be held until arrangements could be made for repatriation. Kay and 46 other women were herded into the cargo hold of a transport ship. The space was dark and cramped. They slept on thin blankets spread over the metal floor. The ship's engines rumbled constantly beneath them, a deep vibration that seemed to shake their bones. Some women vomited from seasickness. Others stared at the walls, their minds far away. For 2 weeks, they sailed across the Pacific Ocean. Kay spent most of that time writing in a small notebook she had managed to keep hidden in her uniform. She did not know why she wrote. Perhaps to remember. Perhaps to make sense of what was happening. Perhaps because if she died, someone might find the notebook and know she had existed, that she had been real, that she had mattered. On the night before they reached California, she wrote, "Tomorrow we arrive in the enemy's land. I have heard stories of what Americans do to prisoners." My hands shake as I write this. Mother, if you ever read these words, please know I tried to serve with honor. I tried to make Takeshi proud. I tried not to shame our family. But I am so afraid. More afraid than I have ever been. More afraid than when the bombs fell on Saipan. More afraid than when I learned Takeshi was dead. Because at least in those moments, I knew what was happening. I understood the danger. Now I know nothing except that tomorrow I will step onto enemy soil, and whatever happens next will happen. I cannot control it. I cannot fight it. I can only endure. I hope death comes quickly. I hope it does not hurt too much. I hope you never learn the details of how I died. I hope you can believe I remained honorable until the end. She closed the notebook and tucked it into her uniform pocket next to her mother's letter. Then she lay down on her thin blanket and tried to sleep. Around her in the darkness, other women whispered prayers or cried softly or lay in silence, each alone with her fear. Dawn broke gray and cold over San Francisco Bay. Kay and the other women were ordered on deck. They formed two ragged lines, their hands gripping the rails so hard their knuckles turned white. They wore what remained of their Joshigun uniforms. The once neat gray-green skirts and jackets were now torn, stained with oil, soy, and sweat, faded by weeks at sea. Most of the women were young, between 18 and 25. Their faces were thin and hollow from poor rations during the final months of the war. As the ship approached the dock, the fog began to lift. Through the gray mist, the city appeared. Buildings rising into the sky. Tall buildings, intact buildings, undamaged buildings. For women who had lived through constant bombing raids in the Pacific, the sight was strange and unsettling. America looked whole. America looked powerful. America looked like it had never been touched by war. Japan had lost everything. These women had seen their cities burned, their people starved, their nation brought to its knees. But America looked like it was doing just fine. Then they heard the noise. At first, it was just a low rumble like distant thunder. But as the ship moved closer to the dock, the sound grew louder, sharper, more focused. It was voices, hundreds of voices, streaming voices. The women pressed against the rail, trying to see through the thinning fog. And then they saw the crowd. Civilians packed the dock. Men in work clothes, women in dresses, some teenagers. Their faces were red with anger, their fists raised in the air. American flags waved violently. Handmade signs bobbed above the crowd. Even from the ship, Kay could make out some of the words. Remember Pearl Harbor. Killers, send them back. The screaming was so loud it seemed to shake the air itself. It was not just noise. It was rage. Pure, undiluted rage. 4 years of war. Hundreds of thousands of American soldiers dead. Sons and brothers and husbands who would never come home. And here, arriving at their dock, were enemy women. The face of the nation that had started this war. The people responsible for all that death. Kay's legs went weak. She grabbed the woman next to her for support. Around her, others began to cry. One woman whispered, "This is how we die." Another made a small sound like a wounded animal. They had expected punishment, yes. They had expected prison. But this was a mob that wanted blood. The ship's engines cut to idle. Ropes were thrown to the dock workers. The gangway clanged into place with a sound like a prison door slamming shut. An American officer appeared on deck. He was tall and broad-shouldered with a weathered face that suggested he had seen combat. He barked something in English, then switched to broken Japanese. Form line. Walk. No run. No talk. The women formed two lines, their bodies pressed close together, seeking comfort in nearness. Their hearts pounded. Their breathing came quick and shallow. Everything they had been taught was about to be proven true. The Americans were going to let the mob tear them apart. This was how enemies treated prisoners. This was why death was preferable to capture. As the first woman stepped onto the gangway, a rock flew through the air. It hit the metal railing beside her with a sharp clang that made everyone flinch. The crowd roared louder, feeding on their own fury. This was not the beginning they had imagined. This was terror made real. If you or your family served during World War II, you know how deep those divisions ran, how real the hatred was on both sides, how impossible forgiveness seemed when the wounds were still fresh and bleeding. This story is not just about history. It is about whether human decency can survive war, whether kindness can be more powerful than propaganda, whether we define ourselves by who we hate or by who we choose to protect. If these questions matter to you, if you believe the values that made America great are worth remembering, make sure to like this video and subscribe to our channel, because we are going to spend the next hour together uncovering a story that most history books left out. A story about 47 Japanese women, one American guard, and the chocolate bar that changed everything. A story about the moment when the enemy became the shield. But first, we need to see what happened when that first woman's foot touched the dock, when the mob surged forward, when it seemed like the guards would step aside and let American rage finally find its target. What happened next would define everything that came after. The moment the first woman's foot touched the dock, the crowd surged forward like a wave breaking against rocks. Police officers in uniform struggled to hold back the massive bodies, pressing against wooden barriers that groaned underway when the barriers were meant to keep order. They were not meant to hold back this much rage. A woman in the front row, maybe 50 years old, with gray streaks in her dark hair and a face carved hollow by grief, screamed at the Japanese prisoners. Her voice cut through all the other noise, sharp and terrible. "My son died at Iwo Jima. You monsters. You murderers." The words hit Kei like a physical blow. Iwo Jima, the same battle where Takeshi had died. This woman's son and Kei's brother had killed each other, or if not each other directly, then they had died in the same hell on opposite sides of the same senseless slaughter. Two 19-year-old boys who should have been thinking about girls and shells and the future dead in the volcanic sand of a tiny island that most people had never heard of before the war. For a moment, Kei wanted to call out to the woman, to tell her that she understood, that she too had lost someone at Iwo Jima, that they were bound together by the same grief, the same loss, the same stupid waste of young life. But her voice would not work. Her throat was closed tight with fear. The Japanese prisoners froze on the gangway. All their training, all the drilling about maintaining dignity and following orders evaporated in the face of this howling mob. Several women stumbled, nearly falling. Others raised their arms over their heads, trying to protect themselves from the objects flying through the air. More rocks, wadded paper, a glass bottle that shattered on the wood planks with a sound like breaking bones. Someone's shoe thrown with such force it left a dent in the wooden crate beside the gangway. "Move, keep moving," American military guards ran forward, their boots pounding on the dock. There were maybe 20 of them, all young men in United States Army uniforms. Their faces were serious and tense. They wore helmets and carried rifles slung over their shoulders. For a moment, Kei was certain they were coming to drag the prisoners to the crowd, to let the mob have what it wanted, to step aside and let American justice be served. But they did not step aside. The guards formed two lines along both sides of the gangway and the path to the trucks. They stood facing outward toward the crowd, their backs to the prisoners, creating a corridor, a human barrier between the mob and the 47 terrified women who had expected death, but not quite like this. Kei walked in the middle of the line, her eyes fixed on the back of the woman in front of her. Miko, the young secretary who was barely 20, who cried every night in the ship's cargo hold, who had written a suicide note that she carried in her pocket in case capture became unbearable. Miko's shoulders were shaking. Her steps were unsteady, but she kept walking because there was nothing else to do. Nowhere else to go. The hatred from the crowd felt like heat radiating across the short distance between the barriers and the line of prisoners. Kei could feel it on her skin, hot and suffocating. Spit flew through the air, curses in English that she did not fully understand, but whose meaning was crystal clear in the tone and the rage behind them. A man broke through the barrier on the left side. He was maybe 30 with wild eyes and a face red from screaming. His fist was raised as he ran toward the line of prisoners. Two guards tackled him before he got within 5 feet. They brought him down hard on the wood planks and dragged him back as he screamed and fought and clawed at the ground. They killed Americans. They deserve to die. Let me at them. Let me at them. His voice was raw, broken like something had shattered inside him, and this rage was all that was holding the pieces together. Kay understood that voice. She had heard it in her own head when she learned about Takeshi. That moment when grief transforms into rage because rage is easier to carry than sorrow. For a moment, as the guards wrestled the man back behind the barrier, Kay thought they might let the next person through, that this was just for show, that eventually the guards would step aside and let the mob have what it wanted. But the guards did not step aside. They tightened the corridor instead, drew closer to the prisoners. One guard, a tall man with red hair and freckles and a face that looked too young to have seen war, positioned himself directly beside Kay. When a bottle flew toward her, he stepped in front of her without hesitation. The bottle hit him on the shoulder with a dull thud. He grunted slightly, but did not move, did not even turn to see who had thrown it. He just adjusted his stance and kept walking beside her, his body a shield between her and the mob's fury. Kay stared at his back, at the way his uniform stretched across his broad shoulders, at the way he moved with absolute certainty and purpose. This was an American soldier, the enemy, the monster from the propaganda posters. He should want her dead. He should be leading the charge against her. His people had every right to hate her people. His country had been attacked. His soldiers had been killed. He had every reason to step aside and let the mob exact revenge. But he did not step aside. Why? The question burned in Kay's mind, even as her legs kept moving, even as her heart pounded so hard she thought it might burst through her ribs. Why would he protect me? The walk from the ship to the waiting trucks was only about 200 yards. Under normal circumstances, it would take maybe 3 minutes. But this walk felt like hours. Every step brought new screams, new insults, new objects thrown through the air. The crowd pressed against the barriers so hard the wood creaked. Police whistles shrieked as more officers ran to reinforce this line, but there were not enough of them. Not nearly enough. Near the front of the line of prisoners, a young woman who had been a nurse suddenly collapsed to her knees. She was maybe 19 with a round face that still held traces of childhood. She sobbed openly, her hands covering her face, her whole body shaking. The crowd cheered at her fall, mocking her tears, delighting in her terror. Do not give them the satisfaction. The voice came from behind Kay. It was Hana Yoshida, the oldest of the prisoners, at 35, a senior nurse who had worked in field hospitals during the worst of the fighting. Hana moved forward through the line and bent down beside the collapsed girl. She put her arm around her shoulders and lifted her to her feet with surprising strength. We walk with dignity. We do not let them see us broken. Hana spoke in Japanese, but the tone needed no translation. It was the voice of a leader, of someone who had seen worse than this and survived, of someone who refused to let fear win. The young nurse wiped her eyes and nodded. Together they continued forward, Hana supporting her with one arm, both of them holding their heads high, despite the screaming and the thrown objects and the overwhelming weight of hatred pressing down on them from all sides. The guards worked quickly now, their movements efficient and coordinated. They had done this before Kay realized. Maybe not with Japanese prisoners, but they had dealt with angry crowds. They knew how to position their bodies, how to watch for threats, how to move people through danger. 3 military trucks waited at the end of the dock, their canvas covers rolled back to reveal empty truck beds with metal floors. No seats, no cushions, just hard surfaces and the smell of diesel fuel and motor oil. An officer with sergeant stripes on his uniform shouted orders in English, pointing at the trucks. His face was set in hard lines, focused entirely on getting these prisoners loaded and away from the dock before the crowd broke through completely. And get in now. The women scrambled up into the truck beds, helping each other climb over the high tailgates. Kay found herself squeezed between Amiko and another woman whose name she did not know. All of them breathing hard and all of them trembling with a mixture of adrenaline and fear and the strange, disorienting relief of still being alive when they had been so certain they were about to die. As the last women climbed aboard, the guards jumped up after them. They stood at the back of each truck, facing outward toward the crowd that was still screaming, still pressing against the now bending barriers. The guards created one final human wall between the prisoners and the mob. The red-haired guard who had protected Kay was right there standing at the back of her truck. His back was to her, his hand rested on the rifle slung over his shoulder. He did not draw the weapon, but his fingers rested on it with casual familiarity, and the message was absolutely clear. He would use it if he had to. He would shoot American civilians to protect Japanese prisoners if that was what it took. The truck engines roared to life, loud enough to momentarily drown out even the screaming. The vehicles lurched forward with a grinding of gears that threw everyone slightly off balance. The crowd followed, running alongside the trucks, still screaming, still throwing whatever they could find. A man with a face twisted in pure hatred got close enough to spit at Kay's truck. The spittle hit the canvas cover and slowly dripped down. The guards did not move. They stood solid and unmoving human walls of muscle and determination and something else. Something Kay did not have a word for in Japanese or in the limited English she had learned in school. It was not just duty. Duty would make them guard the prisoners, but this was something more. This was active protection. This was choosing to put their bodies between harm and the helpless, even when the helpless were the enemy. As the trucks pulled away from the waterfront and turned onto city streets, the crowd gradually fell behind. Their screams echoed between the buildings, bouncing off brick and concrete, but growing fainter with each block. Finally, after several minutes that felt like a lifetime, the noise faded completely. The women in the truck sat in stunned silence, eyes wide, bodies still shaking. The adrenaline that had kept them moving was starting to fade, leaving behind exhaustion and confusion and the slow creeping realization that they were alive. They had survived the mob. One woman started to cry, then another. Soon soft sobs filled the truck, the sound of relief and shock and trauma all mixed together. They were not pretty tears. They were raw and ugly and real. The kind of crying that comes from the deepest part of you, the part that holds all the fear you cannot show when you need to be strong. Kay did not cry. She could not. The tears were there pressing against the back of her eyes, but they would not fall. She had cried all her tears for Takeshi. She had cried when her father died. She had used up her lifetime allotment of tears. Now there was just a dry, burning sensation in her chest where feelings should be. For over an hour, the trucks drove through San Francisco and then out into the countryside beyond. The city gradually gave way to open land that it seemed impossibly green after the gray wasteland of war-torn Japan. Fields stretched on both sides of the road, planted with crops that grew in neat rows. Trees lined the highway, their branches heavy with leaves, some already starting to turn gold and red with the approach of fall. Houses stood intact along the road. Real houses with painted walls and shingled roofs and gardens in front. Flowers grew in those gardens. Actual flowers cultivated for beauty rather than food. Children played in yards, throwing balls, riding bicycles, laughing with voices that carried on the wind. A woman hung laundry on a line strung between two posts, white sheets billowing in the breeze like sails. The women in the truck stared at everything, trying to understand what they were seeing. This was the enemy nation, this place of abundance and peace and normalcy. Where were the ruins? Where were the hungry children searching through rubble for anything edible? Where were the burned buildings and the bomb craters and the evidence of a nation at war? Everything they had been told about America, that it was suffering, that it was weak, that it was on the verge of economic and social collapse, but all of it was lies. The evidence was right in front of them, undeniable and overwhelming. America had not been touched by war. Not really. Yes, American soldiers had died overseas. Yes, American families grieved for lost sons and husbands and brothers. But the land itself was whole. The cities were intact. The people looked healthy and well-fed. Meanwhile, Japan was a landscape of devastation. Cities burned to ash, people starving in the streets, children with swollen bellies and vacant eyes. The contrast was so stark, it was almost incomprehensible. Kay watched a woman hanging laundry and felt something break inside her. Not break like shattering, break like a dam giving way. All the propaganda about American weakness flooding out, replaced by the simple, observable truth. America was strong. America had so much abundance, it could afford to grow flowers for beauty and hang clean laundry and let children play instead of work. The red-haired guard finally turned around. He had been standing at the back of the truck, watching the road behind them, making sure they were not being followed. Now he looked at the prisoners, his eyes moving from face to face, taking in their tear-stained cheeks and hollow eyes and the way they huddled together like frightened animals. Then he did something unexpected. He sat down at the edge of the truck bed, lowering himself to their level instead of standing above them. It was a small gesture, but it changed everything. Standing, he was the guard, and they were the prisoners. Sitting, he was just a person sharing a truck bed with other people. He pulled a canteen from his belt. The canteen was standard military-issue dull metal with a canvas cover. He unscrewed the cap and held it out toward the women. Water. Drink. Hot day. His voice was rough, like he was not used to speaking gently, but he was trying. The words came out slow and careful, like he knew the prisoners might not understand English well. He gestured with the canteen, making the offer clear, even without shared language. The women stared at the canteen. No one moved. The silence stretched long enough to become uncomfortable. Kay could see the guard's face changing as he realized they were afraid. Afraid of him. Afraid the water was poisoned or drugged or some kind of trick. He seemed to consider this for a moment, then he lifted the canteen to his own lips and drank deeply. His throat worked as he swallowed. When he lowered the canteen, a few drops of water clung to his lips. He wiped them away with the back of his hand and held the canteen out again. The message was clear. Not poisoned, safe to drink, just water on a hot day for people who were thirsty. Hannah, who had helped the young nurse on the dock, reached out first. She took the canteen with both hands, treating it carefully like something precious. She sniffed it, checking for any strange odor. Then she took a small sip. Her eyes widened. She took another sip longer this time. Then she passed the canteen to the woman next to her. It was cool, clean water, not the warm metallic tasting liquid they had been given on the ship, which had come from tanks that tasted of rust and chemicals. This was fresh water, cold enough to still have a hint of chill from whatever refrigeration or cold storage it had come from. It tasted like water should taste. Like nothing. Like life. The canteen moved from hand to hand. Each woman drank some, taking small, careful sips, others drinking more deeply. When it was empty, the guard refilled it from a larger container secured near the front of the truck. He passed it back and the process repeated. 3 times he refilled the canteen. 3 times it made its way through all the women in the truck. When it finally reached Kay, she drank without hesitation. The cold water hit her throat and she realized just how thirsty she had been. Not just from the heat and the walk and the fear, but from weeks of inadequate water rations on the ship. She drank until her stomach felt full and cool, then reluctantly passed the canteen to Amiko. Thank you. The words came out in English, rough and accented, but clear. Kay had learned some English in school before the war. She had not spoken it in years, had not dared to during her military service when anything associated with the enemy was suspect. But the words came now automatic and necessary. A voice called from the front of the truck. Sullivan, we moving out soon or what? The red-haired guard turned his head toward the voice. 5 more minutes, Davis. He turned back to the prisoners, settling more comfortably on the edge of the truck bed. Sullivan. Kay repeated the name silently in her mind. The American guard who had stepped between her and the mob who had taken a bottle to protect her, who was now giving them water, had a name. Sullivan. She did not know if it was his first name or his family name. Americans did things differently, she remembered from her English classes. Sometimes they used family names, sometimes given names, sometimes both together in ways that confused her. But now he was not just the guard or the enemy or the American. He was Sullivan, a person with a name, and somehow that made everything more real and more complicated. The guard looked surprised. His eyebrows rose slightly, and something in his expression shifted from wary professionalism to actual curiosity. You speak English a little bit. Small, Kay held her thumb and finger close together to show how little. The gesture made the guard smile just slightly, just for a moment. It was the first smile Kay had seen from an American, and it transformed his face from intimidating to almost kind. He was quiet for a moment, looking at Kay as if trying to decide something. Then he spoke again, his voice lower now, meant just for her, even though others could hear. That crowd at the dock. That's not everyone. You understand? Not everyone is like that. Kay was not sure she understood all the words, but she understood the tone. He was trying to tell her something important, trying to make her understand that the screaming mob did not represent all Americans, that there was more to this country than rage. She nodded slowly, processing this information, trying to fit it into her understanding of the world. The guard continued gesturing back toward the city they had left behind. Those people, they lost sons, brothers, husbands, in the war. They're angry, they're hurt. They want someone to blame, someone to punish, but they won't hurt you, we won't let them. He said it with such absolute certainty, as if it was simply a fact of nature. The sky is blue, water is wet. American guards protect prisoners from mobs, as if there was no question, no doubt, no possibility of any other outcome. Kay found her voice, found the question that had been burning in her mind since the moment he stepped between her and that flying bottle. Why we are enemy? The words came out broken, her English, not good enough to express the full weight of what she was asking. But the guard seemed to understand. He looked at her for a long moment, his young face serious, his eyes holding something that looked almost sad. The war is over. You're prisoners now, yes? But you're also people, and we don't let mobs hurt people. That's not who we are. He said it so simply, like it was obvious, like it was the only way things could be. But to Kay, it was revolutionary. It contradicted everything she had been taught about Americans. Everything the propaganda had drummed into her head during training. Everything she had believed about how enemies treated prisoners. In the Japanese military, prisoners were considered less than human. Surrendering was the ultimate dishonor. Being captured meant you had chosen shame over death. And once you were captured, you had no rights, no dignity, no claim to mercy or protection or basic human decency. Prisoners were tools to be used or obstacles to be eliminated. Nothing more. Yet here was this American guard, this enemy soldier, telling her that even as his enemy, even as a prisoner, she was still a person deserving of safety. That her status as a human being superseded her status as an enemy. That whoever she was before the war, whatever uniform she wore, whatever nation she served, she was first and foremost a person. And people deserved protection. The contradiction was almost impossible to process. Kay stared at the back of his head as he turned back around to watch the road, trying to reconcile everything she had believed with everything she was experiencing. The truck continued through the California countryside. The sun climbed higher in the sky, warm on their faces. The motion of the vehicle was almost soothing after the chaos of the dock. Some women began to relax slightly, their shoulders dropping from around their ears, their breathing slowing to something approaching normal. But Kay could not relax. Her mind was churning, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The guard's words echoed in her head. That's not who we are. As if there was a fundamental American identity that included protecting even enemies. As if mercy was not weakness but strength. As if showing compassion to prisoners was not naive idealism but core values. If this was true, if Americans really believed this, then what did that mean about everything else Kay had been taught? What did it mean about the war, about who the good guys and bad guys really were? About which nation truly valued human dignity and which one treated people as expendable? The questions were dangerous. The kind of questions that, if pursued too far, could unravel everything, could force you to confront the possibility that you had fought on the wrong side, that your brother had died for a lie, that the honor you had tried so hard to maintain was based on a false premise. Kay pushed the questions down. Not now, not yet. She did not have the strength to face them now. Maybe later. Maybe never. For now, she just needed to survive, to get through whatever came next, to see what this American prison camp held in store. The war might be over, but another battle was just beginning. A battle inside her own mind between what she had believed and what she was starting to see, between the comfortable certainty of propaganda and the uncomfortable reality of mercy. And Kay had no idea which side would win. The trucks finally pulled through the gates of Camp Norton, a temporary holding facility in the Central Valley of California. The gates were chain-link fenced, topped with the coils of barbed wire that glinted in the afternoon sun. Guard towers rose at each corner, tall wooden structures with roofs to shelter the sentries from sun and rain. Men stood in those towers with rifles watching the trucks enter, but their postures were relaxed, almost bored. This was a prison camp. The fences and towers and armed guards made that clear. But compared to what the women had expected, compared to the hellish conditions they had been warned about in their training, Camp Norton looked almost normal, almost benign. Wooden barracks stood in neat rows painted a utilitarian gray-green that matched the military aesthetic. The paths between them were swept clean, no trash or debris visible. Small gardens had been planted near the administrative buildings, flowers growing in organized beds. Marigolds and zinnias, their bright colors almost obscene in their cheerfulness. Guard towers rose at each corner. Yes, but the guards in them looked more like they were fulfilling a boring duty than preparing for violence. As the women climbed down from the trucks, their legs stiff from the long ride, they bunched together instinctively. There was safety in numbers, or at least the illusion of safety. American soldiers watched from various points around the camp, but none approached aggressively. A few looked curious. Some looked uncomfortable, like they were not sure how to feel about Japanese women prisoners. Others looked away entirely, as if the prisoners were something they would rather not acknowledge. An officer with gray hair and steel-rimmed glasses walked forward holding a clipboard. His uniform was crisp and clean, his posture military straight. He looked maybe 50, old enough to have seen the first war, experienced enough to have earned his rank through more than just time served. His face was weathered but not unkind. "I am Major Roberts. This is your camp until we determine your final placement." He spoke in slow, careful English, his voice carrying across the assembly area. A young woman in United States Army uniform stepped forward beside him. She looked Japanese, maybe in her mid-20s, with black hair pinned up under her military cap. When she spoke, it was in perfect Japanese, her accent suggesting she had grown up speaking the language. "The major says you will be held here as prisoners of war until arrangements can be made for your repatriation to Japan. You will be treated according to the Geneva Convention for prisoners of war." The prisoners listened in silence, their faces showing nothing. They had learned long ago not to show emotion in front of authority, not to reveal weakness, not to give anyone ammunition to use against you. But inside Kay was processing every word, trying to understand what Geneva Convention meant, trying to gauge whether this was truth or more lies designed to make them compliant. The major continued speaking through the interpreter. You will receive food, shelter, medical care, and clothing. You will work, but the work will be light, and you will be paid for it. You will not be harmed. Paid for work. The concept was almost absurd. Prisoners being paid. And in Japan, prisoners worked until they died. They were not compensated. They were barely fed. The idea that America would pay enemy prisoners for labor was either a lie or evidence of a completely different worldview. First, the major said you will go to processing. You will receive medical examination, clean clothing, and hot showers. The interpreter translated the word showers, and a ripple of fear went through the assembled women like wind through grass. Kay felt Emiko stiffen beside her. Another woman made a small sound, quickly stifled. They all knew what showers meant. The propaganda had been very clear. American showers were not for cleaning. They were for killing. Gas chambers disguised as bathrooms. A way to execute prisoners while making them think they were being helped. This was it then. The kindness on the truck, the protection from the mob, the promises of food and medical care, all of it had been designed to make them lower their guard before the real horror began. To make them walk willingly into the gas chambers instead of having to be dragged. A female officer appeared, a woman in her 40s with brown hair going gray at the temples and eyes that crinkled at the corners like she smiled often. She gestured for the prisoners to follow her. Come on, ladies, let's get you cleaned up. Her voice was matter of fact, almost cheerful, as if this was a completely routine task she performed every day, as if she was not leading them to their deaths. Kay felt a strange calm settle over her. If this was how it ended, at least it would be over. At least the fear and uncertainty would stop. At least she would not have to face her mother's disappointment at being captured instead of choosing honorable death. The processing building was long and narrow, divided into sections by temporary partitions. The first station was medical. American nurses in white uniforms waited with stethoscopes hanging around their necks and blood pressure cuffs ready on a table. They looked professional and efficient, their movements practiced and sure. One by one, the prisoners were called forward for examination. Weight recorded on a scale that the nurse tapped with her finger to make sure it was properly zeroed. Height measured against a mark on the wall. Temperature taken with a thermometer placed under the tongue. Blood pressure checked with a cuff that squeezed tight around the upper arm before slowly releasing. When Kay's name was called, she stepped forward with her heart pounding. The nurse who would examine her had a name tag that read, Margaret, the letters neat and official looking. She was maybe 40, with brown hair and a round face that looked like it belonged to someone's mother. She smiled at Kay, a real smile that reached her eyes. Hello, honey, let's see how you're doing. The endearment caught Kay off guard. Honey, a term of affection, something you would call a child or a loved one, not an enemy prisoner. Margaret guided her to sit on a metal stool and began the examination with gentle efficiency. The stethoscope was cold against Kay's chest, even through the thin fabric of her uniform. Margaret listened to her breathing front and back, her face concentrated, but not concerned. She looked in Kay's ears with a small light, then her throat asking her to say ah in English. She examined Kay's hands, turning them over to check both sides, noting the calluses from work and the way her nails were broken and ragged. When Margaret discovered the long scar on Kay's arm, the one from the shrapnel at Saipan, she made a soft sound of sympathy. Her fingers traced along the raised tissue, feeling the way it had healed, checking for any signs of infection or complication. That must have hurt. Does it still bother you? Kay understood enough English to shake her head. The scar was old, 6 months healed. It pulled sometimes when she moved her arm certain ways, but it did not hurt anymore. Not really. Not compared to other things that hurt. Margaret made notes on a form attached to her clipboard, her handwriting quick and neat. Then she reached for a small paper cup and shook 2 white pills into it from a larger bottle. She held the cup out to Kay. Vitamins. You're malnourished. These will help. Kay stared at the pills. They were small and white and looked innocent enough. But poison could look innocent. Poison could be hidden in anything. This could be how they did it. Not gas chambers, but pills. Quieter, easier to manage. Give each prisoner 2 pills, and within hours, they would all be dead. Margaret seemed to read the fear on Kay's face. She set down the cup and picked up another one, shaking 2 identical pills into her own hand. Then making eye contact with Kay to make sure she was watching, Margaret put both pills in her mouth and swallowed them with water from a nearby pitcher. She opened her mouth afterward to show they were gone, then smiled and pointed at Kay's cup. Your turn. The gesture was so simple, so direct, that Kay found herself reaching for the cup before she consciously decided to trust. She put the pills in her mouth. They tasted bitter chalky with a slight chemical tang. She swallowed them with water Margaret poured for her. The water was cool and clean, tasting of nothing but itself. Good girl. Next station. Margaret patted her shoulder in a gesture that was almost motherly, then made a notation on her form and called for the next prisoner. Kay moved on her mind, still processing what had just happened. The nurse had taken the same pills, had proven they were safe, had treated Kay not like an enemy or a prisoner, but like a patient, like someone whose health mattered. At each station in the processing line, the pattern repeated. Professional treatment delivered with matter-of-fact efficiency. A doctor who looked at old injuries and made notes about nutrition levels. A clerk who recorded personal information, name and age and place of origin, writing everything down carefully in a ledger. Another clerk who took what few personal possessions they had, examined each item, and returned anything that was not considered dangerous. Kay got back her notebook and the letters from her mother and Takeshi, though they kept the small knife she had used for cutting thread. No one yelled, no one threatened, no one hurt them. The disconnect between expectation and reality was so vast that it was almost more frightening than cruelty would have been. Cruelty made sense. Cruelty confirmed what they had been taught. But this professional, almost gentle processing, it made no sense at all. The shower room was the final station, and the fear that had been building throughout processing crystallized into something cold and hard in Kay's chest. This was where it would happen. This was where the pretense would end and the real American brutality would begin. Steam rose from behind a row of curtained stalls, white clouds that billowed and dissipated near the ceiling. The room was warm and damp, the air thick with moisture. 6 shower stalls lined one wall, simple enclosures with curtains for privacy. On a bench near the entrance sat stacks of clean towels and folded clothing. The prisoners stopped just inside the doorway, forming a tight cluster, no one willing to move forward. This was it. This was where they would die. All the kindness before had been designed to bring them here willingly, to make them walk into the gas chambers without fighting. Several women began to cry quiet sobs they tried to muffle. Others prayed, their lips moving in silent entreaties to gods and ancestors. Kay closed her eyes and thought of Takeshi. If she was about to die, she wanted his face to be the last thing in her mind. His gap-toothed smile when he was 7. The way he used to follow her around the apartment, asking questions about everything. The pride in his voice when she joined the Joshigun. She hoped he was waiting for her wherever the dead went. She hoped she had done enough to earn an honorable place beside him. The female officer in charge stepped forward. Lieutenant Sarah Chen, according to her name tag. She was Japanese-American. Kay could tell from her features, though her bearing was entirely American military. She spoke in Japanese, her accent American, but her vocabulary perfect. I know what you've been told. I know you think the showers are something terrible. They're not. They're just showers. Hot water and soap, that's all. Watch. She walked into one of the stalls, fully clothed in her military uniform. The sound of water turning on echoed in the tile room, loud and immediate. Hot water began streaming from the shower head, creating more clouds of steam. Lieutenant Chen put her hand under the spray, letting the water run over her fingers, then held her wet hand out through the curtain for everyone to see. She stepped back out of the stall, her uniform sleeves soaked and dripping. Water ran down her arm and pattered onto the concrete floor. With obvious dislike, their faces hardening, their jaws clenching. A few turned their backs entirely, refusing even to acknowledge the prisoner's presence. The hatred was still there, just quieter, more controlled, but no less real. These men had fought in the Pacific, had seen their friends die, had killed Japanese soldiers, and would probably kill more if the war started again. They were eating lunch with enemy women because orders said they had to, not because they wanted to. Then an older soldier stood up. He was maybe 40, with gray at his temples and sergeant stripes on his uniform. His face was weathered and scarred, the kind of face that told stories without words. He walked to the serving line, filled a tray with food, carried it to an empty table, sat down, and began to eat. Completely normal, completely calm. As if eating lunch in a room with Japanese prisoners was the most ordinary thing in the world. The message was clear. If the Sarge could do it, so could they. He was not afraid of poisoned food or contaminated tables or whatever invisible threat the prisoners might represent. He was just eating his lunch. And if he could, so could everyone else. Major Roberts appeared and gestured to the prisoners. His voice was firm, but not unkind. Form a line, get your food, sit and eat. Slowly, hesitantly, the women moved forward. Kay found herself at the serving counter where a cook in a stained white apron stood with a large metal spoon in his hand. He looked at her for a moment, his expression unreadable, then plopped a generous serving of beef stew onto her plate. The sound alone was beautiful, that wet, meaty plop of thick stew landing on ceramic. But the sight was almost unbelievable. Chunks of actual beef, dark brown and tender looking, floating in thick gravy with carrots and potatoes and onions. More meat than Kay had seen in a single meal in months. Maybe a year. 2 slices of white bread appeared next to it, still warm from the oven, soft and perfect. Then a scoop of green beans glistening with butter. Then a cup of dark coffee. And finally, almost carelessly, as if it was nothing special, a slice of apple pie with a golden crust and filling that oozed slightly at the edges. It was more food than Kay had seen in a single meal since before the war. Maybe more than she had ever seen on one plate in her entire life. In Japan, even before the war, meals were simple. Rice and vegetables, and maybe a little fish or meat for flavor. But this was abundance. This was excess. This was America saying we have so much we can afford to give even our prisoners more food than they know what to do with. She carried her tray to a table where other prisoners were already sitting, all of them staring at their plates with identical expressions of disbelief. No one ate. No one moved. They just stared. If you served in the military, or if your father or grandfather did, you might remember the power of a simple meal shared. The way food could break down barriers between men who had nothing else in common. The way breaking bread together, even with strangers, even with former enemies, was one of the oldest human rituals of peace. These women were about to experience that ritual for the first time from the other side. Not as hosts, but as guests. Not as conquerors, but as prisoners who were being fed by the people they had fought against. And that simple act of being given food, good food, abundant food, was about to crack open something deep inside each of them. Hannah, sitting at the head of the table, picked up her spoon. She took a small amount of stew and brought it to her mouth. Her eyes closed as she tasted it. For a long moment, she said nothing. Then she whispered in Japanese, "It's good. It's real. The meat is real." That was all the permission the others needed. Spoons and forks moved. Bread was lifted to mouths. Coffee was sipped. And slowly, then faster, as hunger overcame all other considerations, the women began to eat. Kay picked up her spoon. The metal felt substantial in her hand, heavy and solid, not like the thin, bent utensils they had been given on the ship. She dipped it into the stew, watching the thick gravy coat the spoon, and brought it to her mouth. The first taste was a revelation. Rich, savory, complex. The beef was so tender it fell apart at the touch of her teeth, not tough or gristly, unlike the occasional meat she remembered from before the war. The gravy was thick and deeply flavored, seasoned with herbs she could not name, but that tasted like comfort itself, like safety, like home, even though this was the furthest thing from home imaginable. Carrots and potatoes had absorbed the meat flavor, soft and satisfying, dissolving on her tongue. She took another bite, then another. Each spoonful seemed to reach a part of her that had been empty for so long she had forgotten it could be filled. This was not just food. This was abundance. This was a nation saying we have so much we can give even our enemies more than they need to survive. We can give them enough to feel satisfied, even full. The white bread came next. Kay picked up a slice still warm from the oven, soft enough that her fingers left slight impressions in it. She tore off a piece and put it in her mouth. The texture was like clouds if clouds could be eaten. Soft and airy and slightly sweet with a hint of yeast and salt. So different from the dense black bread of wartime Japan, the kind that sat heavy in your stomach and took effort to chew. There was butter on the table. Real butter, pale yellow, in a ceramic dish. Kay had not seen butter in years. She spread some on her bread and watched it melt, turning the white surface glossy and golden. The taste was rich and creamy, coating her mouth with fat and salt and something indefinably luxurious. She ate half the slice before she even thought to try the vegetables. The green beans were cooked just enough to be tender, but still had some bite. They were coated in butter, too glistening with it, and seasoned with something that might have been garlic or black pepper, or both. Each bite was a small burst of flavor, familiar and foreign at the same time. The coffee was bitter and hot. Kay did not particularly like coffee, had only tried it a few times before the war, but the bitterness cut through the richness of the food and made her feel more alert, more present. She added sugar from a bowl on the table, watching the white crystals dissolve into the black liquid, then tasted it again. Better, sweet and bitter together, complex and warming. Finally, she turned her attention to the apple pie. The crust was golden brown, flaky, obviously made with real butter. The filling oozed slightly at the edges, thick and sticky, and studded with what looked like raisins or maybe cinnamon. Kay cut off a small piece with her fork. The crust crumbled at the touch, layers of pastry separating. The filling was hot and sweet. Apples cooked until they were soft but not mushy. Seasoned with spices that tasted like autumn and celebration and things she had only read about in books. Sugar, so much sugar. More sugar in this one slice of pie than she had eaten in 6 months. The sweetness was almost overwhelming. making her teeth ache slightly, but she ate it anyway, chasing away the bitterness of the coffee with each sweet bite. Around her, the other women were having similar experiences. Some ate slowly, savoring every bite, trying to make it last. Others ate quickly, almost desperately, as if afraid the food would disappear or be taken away before they could finish. A few ate until they looked sick, their stomachs unused to such rich food after months of poor rations. Amiko ate her bread and butter and cried at the same time, tears running down her face as she chewed, unable to stop either the eating or the crying. Hana ate with the methodical efficiency of a nurse who had learned to eat whenever food was available, because you never knew when the next meal would come. Another woman, a former radio operator like Kay, ate 3 bites of stew and then had to stop her hand over her mouth, her eyes wide with something that looked like panic or joy or both. Kay ate everything on her plate, the stew, both pieces of bread, all the green beans, the entire slice of pie. She drank 2 cups of coffee, and when she was finished, when her plate was empty and her stomach was fuller than it had been in a year, she sat back and felt something break open inside her chest. Guilt, sharp and hot and terrible. While she sat here eating beef stew and apple pie, her mother was probably digging through rubble in Osaka looking for anything edible, boiling grass to make soup, standing in line for hours for a handful of rice, starving, literally starving. And Kay was eating apple pie in an American prison camp. The contradiction was unbearable. She should be suffering. She should be punished. She was the enemy. She had worked for the military that attacked Pearl Harbor, that killed American soldiers that started this war. She deserved to be treated badly. She deserved to go hungry. She deserved whatever cruelty America wanted to inflict. But instead, she had been given hot showers and clean clothes and more food than she could eat. She had been protected from angry mobs. She had been treated with a basic level of human decency that her own government had not shown its people in the final months of the war. What did that mean? What did any of this mean? Across the mess hall, Sullivan sat at a table with other guards. He was eating the same food as the prisoners, nothing special or different, just standard military rations that happened to be more abundant than anything Japan could provide its soldiers. As Kay watched, he looked up and their eyes met for a brief moment. He did not smile, did not nod, just looked at her with an expression she could not read, then returned to his food. But in that brief moment of eye contact, something passed between them. Not understanding exactly, not forgiveness, but a recognition, an acknowledgement that they were both here, both eating both human beings, caught up in something larger than themselves. They were enemies. The war had made them enemies. Their nations were enemies. Everything about their situation said they should hate each other. But somehow in this moment, eating in the same room, breathing the same air, existing in the same space without violence or cruelty, weeks on a ship. Still no one moved. The fear was too deep, too ingrained. Even with the demonstration, even with Lieutenant Chen standing there with her wet sleeve, the prisoners could not make themselves step forward. Lieutenant Chen sighed, but it was not an angry or impatient sound. It was understanding. She had probably seen this fear before, knew where it came from, knew that years of propaganda could not be undone with one demonstration. I'll tell you what, I'll stand right here the whole time. The door stays open. If anything bad happens, which it won't, you can run out. All of you together could probably overpower me if you needed to. But you need to wash. You've been on a ship for 2 weeks. You need to be clean for your health, for your dignity, for yourselves. She emphasized the last words. For yourselves. As if what the prisoners wanted mattered. As if their dignity and health were worth preserving, even though they were enemies. Hana, the senior nurse who had helped the young woman on the dock, stepped forward. At 35, she was the oldest of the prisoners, and her years working in field hospitals had given her a kind of authority that came from surviving things that killed others. She looked at Lieutenant Chen for a long moment, then at the still running shower, then back at the other prisoners. I will go first. If I die, you will know not to follow. She walked into the stall with her back straight and her head high, like she was walking to an execution with dignity intact. The curtain fell closed behind her. The other women held their breath listening. The sound of water continued steady and unchanged. Then there was the rustle of clothing being removed. More water sounds. And then, after what felt like an eternity, but was probably less than a minute, a long, deep sigh. It's real. Hana's voice came from behind the curtain, speaking in Japanese, filled with something that sounded almost like wonder. It's just water. Hot water. And soap. Real soap. The words broke the spell. One by one, other women moved toward the stalls. Slowly at first, then with increasing confidence, as each woman who entered emerged minutes later, not dead, but clean, wrapped in towels, her face showing the same surprise and something else. Something like relief so profound, it bordered on joy. When Kay's turn came, she entered a stall and stood for a moment looking at the simple setup. White tile walls, somewhat aged but clean. A shower head mounted on the wall, plain chrome that had been polished recently. A metal dish holding a bar of white soap, a drain in the floor. Nothing sinister, nothing that looked like a gas chamber or an execution device. Just a shower. She reached out and turned the knob. Hot water burst out with surprising pressure, loud as it hit the tile. The water was hot. Not warm, not lukewarm. Actually hotter than anything she had felt in months, maybe years. Steam rose immediately, clouding the air, making it hard to see. Kay stood under the spray and let it soak her hair, her skin, her entire body. The water ran brown at first, washing away weeks of accumulated grime and salt and oil. It plastered her hair to her skull and ran down her face and pooled around her feet before disappearing down the drain. The heat soaked into her muscles, loosening tension she had been carrying so long she had forgotten it was there. She reached for the soap. The bar was large and white, unmarked by any brand or label. She brought it to her nose and inhaled. Flowers. It smelled like flowers, roses maybe, or lavender, or some combination of scents that her war-exhausted brain could not quite identify. But it was flowers, something beautiful, something gentle. In Japan, toward the end of the war, soap had become a memory, something that had existed before in the old life, in the time before everything fell apart. People washed with ash and water, if they washed at all. They scrubbed their skin raw, trying to feel clean, with nothing but hope and prayers and sheer determination. But real soap, the kind that made lather and smelled like flowers and actually got you clean, that had disappeared years ago. Kay rubbed the soap between her hands and watched it create foam. White foam that spread across her palms and between her fingers. She washed her arms, her chest, her legs, her feet. She washed her hair, working the soap through the tangles, feeling the individual strands become clean and slippery under her fingers. She washed her face, careful around her eyes, feeling the soap strip away dirt she had not even known was there. And then, without warning or permission, she began to cry. The tears mixed with the shower water and the soap, all of it running down her face together, until she could not tell which was which. She put one hand against the tile wall to steady herself and let the sobs come raw and ugly and necessary. It was not grief, not exactly. It was not relief, not just that. It was something more complicated, a release of tension she had been holding for so long it had become part of her skeletal structure. The hot water and soap were not just cleaning her body, they were stripping away layers of propaganda and fear and lies, exposing something underneath that she had forgotten existed. Her humanity. For years she had been a soldier, a servant of the emperor, a tool of the military machine. Then she had been a prisoner, an enemy, a potential victim of mob violence. But under all that buried so deep she had lost touch with it, she was still just a person. A person who had once played with her brother in the streets of Osaka. A person who had cried when her father died. A person who liked the smell of flowers and the feel of hot water and the simple pleasure of being clean. When she finally turned off the water and stepped out, her skin was pink from the heat and the scrubbing. A clean towel waited on the bench, soft and thick. She dried herself slowly, carefully, like someone learning how to inhabit a body again after being away for too long. Clean clothing lay folded beside the towel. A simple gray dress, shapeless and utilitarian, but clean and whole. Underwear, socks, canvas shoes, no uniform, no military insignia, just plain clothes for a plain person. She dressed and looked at herself in a small mirror mounted on the wall. The woman looking back was almost a stranger. Her face had filled out slightly from the voyage, the worst of the hollow hunger look starting to fade. Her hair, still damp, hung around her face in dark strands. Her eyes were clearer than they had been in months. She looked human. She looked alive. The woman who emerged from that shower room was not the same woman who had entered. Something fundamental had shifted. The war had told her that Americans were monsters. The mob at the dock had seemed to confirm it. But the guards who protected her, the nurse who examined her gently, the hot water and soap given freely, these things did not match the story she had been taught. And that mismatch was creating a crack in the wall of belief she had built her entire life upon. A crack that, if it continued to widen, might bring the whole structure crashing down. After showers and clean clothes, the women were led to the mess hall, and the smell hit them the moment the door opened. It was not one smell, but many, all layered together in a combination that made Kay's empty stomach clench with sudden desperate hunger. Coffee, the bitter, rich smell of it brewing in large metal pots. Bread, yeast and wheat, and that particular warm scent of baking. Meat cooking, the savory smell of beef and seasonings of fat rendering and flavors combining. And underneath it all, something sweet, sugar and cinnamon and butter, pie maybe, or cake, or some American dessert Kay had no name for. Several women actually stopped in the doorway, physically unable to move forward because the smell was so overwhelming. They had not eaten since early morning, just a small bowl of rice on the ship. Now it was late afternoon and their stomachs were cramping with hunger and the smell of real food, abundant food, well-prepared food, was almost more than they could process. But fear still held them back. Food could be poison. This could still be a trap. The showers had been real, yes, but maybe the food was how they would die. Slowly, painfully. A better death than one, but still death. The mess hall was already half full of American soldiers eating their lunch. The soldiers looked up when the prisoners entered. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. Forks paused halfway to mouths. The silence was thick and uncomfortable, charged with tension and unspoken hostility. Some soldiers stared with open curiosity, their eyes moving over the Japanese women with the kind of attention you give to something foreign and slightly dangerous. Other moment, eating in the same room, breathing the same air, existing in the same space without violence or cruelty, they were also just people. Two people who had both lost someone in the war. Two people who were tired and confused and trying to make sense of a world that no longer made sense. Kay looked down at her empty plate and felt the crack in her beliefs widen a little more. Not breaking completely, not yet, but definitely cracking. Like ice on a pond in early spring. Still solid enough to stand on, but with the distinct sound of fractures spreading underneath. If you served in the military, or if your father or grandfather, did you know the power of a shared meal? How food could break barriers. How breaking bread together, even with former enemies, was the first step toward peace. These women were experiencing that from the other side. Prisoners being fed by those they fought against. And that generosity was dismantling everything they thought they knew. If this story is moving you, like this video and comment below. Did your father serve in the Pacific? Did he talk about how prisoners were treated? Share this with someone who served. Because these moments, these choices to extend mercy instead of revenge, define who we are as Americans. Not our weapons, not our victories, but our values. Because what happened next at Camp Norton would test those values even further. Over the following days, a routine established itself. 6 a.m. the bell rang. Wash. Dress in gray dresses so different from military uniforms that Kay sometimes forgot who she had been. 6:30. Breakfast. This was where reality diverged most from expectation. Eggs cooked in butter. Toast with strawberry jam. Coffee with cream and sugar. And bacon. Every morning bacon appeared on her plate. Strips of pork, crispy and salty, tasting like pure indulgence. Kay had never tasted bacon before the war. During the war, meat became a memory. But at Camp Norton, bacon was given to prisoners every single morning, more abundance than made sense. The first bite tasted like salt and smoke and something revolutionary. And every morning as she ate it, the crack in her beliefs grew wider. The crack became a chasm. It happened one afternoon in the garden where Kay pulled weeds alongside Sullivan. He taught her the names of plants: tomatoes, beans, squash. His hands were gentle with the soil, careful not to damage roots. Hands that could have hurt her, but chose not to. When she asked why he protected prisoners, his answer came quiet. My brother, Daniel, 19, Philippines, 2 months ago. Kay's own hand stopped moving. 19, the same age as Takeshi. Both boys dead in the same stupid war. I'm sorry, she whispered in broken English. Me too, he said. For all of it. They worked in silence after that, two people who had lost everything to the same violence, kneeling in dirt and growing things instead of destroying them. But it was a local woman who finally broke Kay completely. Mrs. Patterson arrived at the camp one October morning, face carved hollow with grief. She had come to see the enemy, to look at the faces of the people who had killed her son. Her boy Robert had died at Iwo Jima, February 1945. When she learned that Kay's brother had died there too 1 month later in March, the older woman's face crumpled. They stood in the garden, enemy women bound by identical loss, and cried together while American guards and Japanese prisoners watched in stunned silence. I don't hate you, Mrs. Patterson said finally, her voice breaking. I thought I would. I thought seeing you would make it better. But you're just a girl who lost her brother too. That night, Kay could not stop shaking. Everything she had believed about honor and shame and the necessity of hatred was collapsing. How could she hate people who treated her with more humanity than her own government had shown its citizens? In November, they announced the repatriation. The women would go home. Sullivan found Kay before she left. He pressed a Hershey bar into her hand, the chocolate she had bought at the canteen but saved, unable to eat something so precious. And a piece of paper with an address in Iowa that they both knew she would never write to. Thank you, she said, for everything. He nodded, shook her hand, turned away quickly. The ship home was nothing like the ship that had brought her. The women were quiet, changed. no longer certain of anything they had once believed without question. When Kay finally reached Osaka, her mother grabbed her in desperate embrace. "You survived," she whispered. "Whatever they did to you, you survived." But Kay could not tell her mother the truth, could not explain that the Americans had given her hot showers and bacon and kindness. That would shame them both. So she stayed silent and let her mother believe she had suffered as prisoners should suffer. 5 years later, Kay's daughter found a chocolate wrapper in a drawer. Brown paper faded but carefully preserved. The child asked what it was. Kay looked at the wrapper for a long moment. Then she knelt down to her daughter's level and began very carefully to tell the truth. Because some stories are too important to stay buried. Some kindnesses are too powerful to forget. And sometimes the most revolutionary act is simply refusing to hate. The enemy had become her shield, and in doing so,